It's time to talk animism. What it is, what it isn't, and why it matters. So what is animism exactly? If you've been in pagan or other alternative religious spaces, particularly within the last, I'd say, 5 to 10 years or so, you've probably seen this term floating around and used in conversation as a descriptor or in other ways as a form of identification. One of the biggest promoters of this concept within Nordic spirituality spaces is Rune Rasmussen with his Nordic Animism channel on YouTube. So what is it? And why does it matter? Particularly within the modern movements that we are all moving within. To give a very short definition, or at least one that's sufficient to start off this conversation, animism is a term that refers to any kind of spirituality that sees the world as having a kind of sacredness imbued in all of the different things and beings that exist within it. It argues for respecting other than human forms of intelligence, and, importantly, has a much more expansive definition of what that means. A definition that often includes natural features like rivers, mountains, and other natural environments, as well as other living beings like plants and animals. Though most or all things in the world around us have some kind of sacredness and intelligence imbued within them, even if it's an intelligence that doesn't really clearly map onto how human beings understand intelligence and agency, this doesn't necessarily mean that all things are God, so to speak, as is argued by perspectives like pantheism. Instead, it's more that everything around us has its own particular agency that requires being treated with a certain level of dignity and respect. The term animism is one that has a little bit of baggage to it because it was first developed by anthropologists as a way of referring to many different forms of indigenous practice and other forms of spirituality that fell outside of the bounds of the often referred to as great religions of the world, which is to say Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, and other revelatory religions that are based around a singular or small set of founders who refer to specific set texts that are used for defining religious belief. What this means is there was something of a tendency for a long time for animism to be used as sort of a shorthand for what were perceived as less sophisticated or less developed spiritual expressions, and often came with the implication of that any particular form of religious or spiritual practice that didn't fit within this kind of revelatory, almost messianic model was one that was automatically unsophisticated, primitive, and backward. It's only recently that this has really begun to be challenged, beginning with the post-colonial intellectual movement as well as the decolonization movement, which has given indigenous voices a much greater degree of agency and credibility than previously was the case. These are also things that have begun to influence the pagan movement to varying degrees, as well as other parallel spiritual movements. This has created space for animism and animistic practice to shift from being treated as sort of an evolutionary throwback within human intellectual and spiritual development, and more as its own valid form of expression that acknowledges, recognizes, and centers the importance of developing and maintaining proper relationships, often referred to as right relationship, with the world around us and what it is that we have to interact with. Climate change in particular is something that I think has especially given animistic ideas and other related ecological forms of spirituality a much needed boost, since the hard realities that we're all living in, such as right now at time of recording, Hurricane Beryl is unleashing a record unprecedented number of tornadoes in Texas, while everywhere around the world in the northern hemisphere this summer has been experiencing record-setting heat waves, which is, of course, making things like fire seasons start off even earlier than they usually do. These hard realities have forced a re-examination of whether the more anthropocentric, which is to say human-centered, forms of spirituality that one tends to see in the world's great religions may have accidentally, or to some extent purposefully, if we're talking Christian nationalists in the United States, thrown our climate and biosphere into a crisis state. These ecological realities have forced the question of whether it is indeed primitive and backward to take into consideration the needs of our ecosystems, the climate, and this planet that right now is the only livable one we've got. So what I'm going to do in this explainer is I'm going to get a bit more into what animism is, why it is relevant in a heathen context, and what this means on a day-to-day basis. Animism, as I think you will come to understand by the end of this episode, is more than just another way of interacting with the world around you and another take on spirituality. It is, in many ways, a fundamental spiritual challenge to a lot of assumptions about how society has been organized and structured. It is also an approach to how we understand and interact with the world that forces us to reevaluate much of what is taken for granted in the world we live in now. So, I've touched a little bit on what animism is to help get this explainer started. And understandably, there's quite a bit more to it than just simply saying that animism is any form of spirituality where there are other than human intelligences which have to be treated with respect and dignity. The problem with this term, as well as this broad definition, is there's a wide range of different expressions and different ways that animism develops around the world. There are some examples, like in Japanese Shinto, where it is fair to say that everything, all the way down to the microphone that I am using to record this podcast, the desk where my computer is sitting, the house that I am in, and the general neighborhood where I'm currently living, have their own particular spirits. Each of these different objects, each of these different places have what's referred to as a kami that's associated with them. On the other end of the spectrum is closer to what we see in Nordic folklore, where there are some things and some places that have a kind of being, and other than human intelligence, to use the long and messy term for it, that are associated with it, but it is also certainly possible for that place to lose that kind of intelligence, for the being that is associated with a particular natural feature or a home or something similar to decide to up stakes and move somewhere else. This can be due to any number of specific factors, but the general pattern when you're talking in the realm of Nordic folklore is due to a breakdown of relationship, sometimes because of a lack of reciprocity, other times because of deliberate action by, as exists within the folklore, zealously Christian individuals who decide that it's time for an Alf or some other similar being associated with a place to move on forcefully. It's also worth mentioning that animistic beings don't necessarily solely exist in relationship with the particular place where they are. If, for example, one were to argue that the Fae that we see in Irish and other neighboring Celtic traditions could be considered animist, and I think one could make an argument that to an extent they broadly fit under this umbrella, then that gets a bit complicated because they also are pretty clearly associated with having their own otherworldly realms that they exist within, as well as having specific places, times, and locations that they are associated with. The same is also true to an extent within the Nordic context, where there is the realm of Alfheim, and there is something of a pattern of certain animistic beings being more associated with these other worlds than they are with just being tied to a particular location. What makes this term even more slippery is that when we then compare these different traditions around the world that have these animistic tendencies, we also see that there tends to be some blurring of lines between what are often referred to as gods as well as specific animistic beings. There are, for example, with the case of the Greeks, for example, you have different spirits of the natural world, like dryads, who are seen as lesser than the gods of Olympus, but are still treated in a similar fashion to gods. The case of Shinto is also an interesting example, in that the term kami is sort of a root word that is applied to all kinds of beings, ranging again from the entity that might be associated with the microphone that I'm speaking into, all the way up to Amaterasu Kami, the goddess of the sun and one of the most significant deities within Shinto practice. The Nordic example also has a similar kind of blurriness, where Freyr is named as king of Alfheim and the Alfar, and the gods are depicted as associating with some of these different beings that could be seen as somewhat animistic, such as, for example, petitioning the dwarves to make many of their greatest artifacts and tools. Animistic belief systems also do not limit what can be interacted with and what intelligences exist as something that needs to be treated with respect to just those things that are of the living world. Many different animistic traditions and practices also have similar forms of ancestor veneration and reverence for the dead, as well as their own different traditions that describe showing respect for and interacting with the dead in a way that honors them, honors particularly the spaces where they're associated with, which is usually their grave sites, and otherwise cultivating relationships with the dead in ways that are somewhat similar to the ways that one cultivates relationships with the beings of the spaces around you. This is all consistent with what we see throughout animistic practice, where boundaries between worlds, boundaries between different kinds of entities and different forms of existence and intelligence tend to be porous rather than hard and fast. This may be something that, particularly for folks that are coming from a Christian background, takes a bit of time and work to get used to. What we see in Christianity in particular is very hard and fast lines between the living and the dead, as well as a tendency to treat anything that is associated with the world around us or other forms of other than human spiritual entities or intelligences with the devil and demonic influences, or in some very rare instances, with being celestial and heavenly in origin. Christian tradition, particularly when you start getting into the early modern age and up to the present day, has a lot of injunctions against these kind of animistic entities, as well as against working with and interacting with the dead. These hard boundaries are something that makes a very strong contrast with the broader tendency that exists within animism towards these blurring of lines, these porous membranes, and sites of exchange where it is not only quite possible, but very normal for human beings and other living entities to interact with other than human, other than animal, and other than materially grounded forms of intelligence. So, to sum it up, before we then get to the heathen context in particular, one could say animism is not so much the broad pop cultural definition of everything has a spirit or something like that, as much as it is a broad grouping of spiritualities where other than human intelligences, both those associated with natural features and living beings, as well as those that are associated with the dead and the deceased, are beings that one has to be in regular relationship with, relationships that are often defined by reciprocity and mutual respect, and the boundaries between different forms of existence, as well as different realms, other worlds, whatever term it is you like to use, are porous and permeable rather than being hard and fixed. To turn now to heathenry and other forms of Nordic and Germanic-derived spirituality, I think it's very safe to say that animistic is a very appropriate term for describing these spiritualities as well as key aspects of it. The other worlds, for example, have permeable rather than hard and fast membranes that allow for passage and movement in between them. This is true of whether you are talking gods that are described as being capable of coming from their particular realms to visit other realms, and this is something that's a fairly common thing that exists, though it's not by any means universal, since what we do have in surviving material suggests that the gods who do this most often are Odin, Loki, and some of the other more wandering deities, you could say, though the fact that there is the Rainbow Bridge suggests that there is a form of passage that is open to all the different gods. There are also ways that human beings can travel between these different realms, though not necessarily in the same way. And I'm talking, of course, of save. Two of the main particular arts of save that are core to this form of mysticism are sitting out, which is a form of meditative practice, also known as utiseta, where one uses deep trance work to gain access to the other worlds or other forms of knowledge, and in some applications can be used to fare forth into the other realms and the other worlds. This can also be done in reverse through the art of spe, often referred to as oracular save or high seat save, where the practitioner becomes a channel, an embodied voice for particular entities, and gives them the means to use the practitioner as a bridge, as a form of communication between the worlds and between wherever it is that being is and those who are wishing to converse with them by means of the spe practitioner. The folklore and practices that heathens draw on for inspiration are also full of animistic entities of all kinds, the Alfar being one of the best examples of this, though certainly not the only one, as well as many other different animistic entities that are said to associate with the worlds around us, which are collectively referred to as the Vitir, or whites in English, spelled W-I-G-H-T, by the way. There is also a sense of permeability around the dead, with particular applications of Saith being used to communicate with the dead by sitting on grave mounds, as well as the dead reaching out into the realms of the living to make their will and desires known. Though sometimes this can be a bit less peaceful than others, as is the case with the Draugr, the restless and angry dead. But generally speaking, this tendency of porosity, accessibility, and the dead being capable of being quite present within the realms of the living is something that is as much true within surviving Nordic and Germanic folklore as it is in many other examples of animistic practice and spirituality. One even has the same kind of slipperiness of the blurring of lines in terms of definitions between the particular animistic beings that exist and the gods themselves. Freyr, as I mentioned earlier, who's one of the Vanic deities, is described as being the king of the Alfar. This puts him in a relationship with all of the Alfar, both those that exist within Alfheim, which is described as an otherworldly realm that is the home of the Alfar, as well as those Alfar that are within the world. There is also the example, as I mentioned before, of the gods interacting with and working with the dwarves, the Vergr, to acquire important tools and artifacts through different means of exchange. Easily, however, the best example of this slipperiness at work can be found with the Jotnar. There are, of course, the mightiest of Jotnar that are effectively on the same level as the Aesir and the rest of the gods, such as Utgard Loki, who Thor wrestles with, in metaphorically speaking anyway, during his journey to the east. You have Jord, literally the goddess of the earth, or at least the closest thing there is to an earth goddess within the Nordic lore, and Surt, the great fire giant, who is said to be the one that will lay ablaze all the 9 worlds at Ragnarok in the battles that have yet to come. And there's also other Jotnar that are associated with particular places, mountains, natural features, and such that are not on the same level as these exceptionally potent Jotnar that duel with, wrestle with, or interact with the gods, but nonetheless are still very much potent and significant beings that exist within the broader cosmology. One of the best examples of this that I've often pointed to in many different places that survives to the present day can be found in the coat of arms for the island of Iceland, where the 4 guardian entities that are said to protect the island are depicted surrounding the seal of the island. And one of these is a massive man-depicted figure that is often described as being a giant. Really, the line between a Vitir of, say, a particular grove or tree and a Jotun of a particular mountain or bay really depends on scale and perspective more than anything else. And the lines that exist between these are more like shades of gray and spectrums than hard and fast boxes and definitions. So what does that mean for practitioners on a day-to-day basis? Well, most practically, and this is something that you see in the way of fire and ice and probably many other forms of heathen practice, this often means giving offerings to whatever Vitir and animistic beings exist in the world around you. This is all part of the same broader pattern of building relationship that exists between gods, that exists as part of ancestor worship and other forms of reverence for the dead within heathen practice, and it makes a certain logical sense. It's a good way to get on good relationships with your well, the spiritual equivalent to neighbors, and keep them in good stead. This, however, I think is only the starting point of what it means to really be integrating animism into your spiritual practice and really thinking in an animistic way. Such work is a great starting place, but it is not the sum total of what it means to be engaging in animistic practice and animistic work, especially because we live in a world that, on a societal level, regularly engages in not just acts of disrespect, but destruction, commodification, and wholesale exploitation of the natural world around us. I think that it is very telling when you look at the different depictions of Ragnarok that when human beings are involved in tripping it off, it's because human beings have completely destroyed their own society and caused complete breakdown. And it's very telling that when there is an ecological aspect to it, that aspect tends to be more external. Like, for example, in Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, he describes the first thing that sets everything in motion as being the Fimbulwinter, a winter lasting for 3 years that effectively kills crops and disintegrates the possibility of maintaining organized society. Neil Price has argued that this may be a sort of cultural memory of a massive volcanic eruption that happened at some point during the 500s, which was serious enough to have caused an ecological crisis for more marginal agricultural regions of the world like Scandinavia. It would therefore probably come as an enormous shock to these different societies that modern heathen spirituality draws inspiration from, that human beings have surpassed this enormous, once in history cataclysm. We are now currently engaging in economic practices that are rapidly destroying this planet's ability to sustain life as we know it. We have also developed different kinds of terrible weapons and technologies that are capable of widespread destruction that would have been unimaginable even 100 years or even 50 years ago. As everything continues to fall out of balance, we are also seeing an increase in what climatologists refer to as extreme weather events. Hurricane Beryl, which I mentioned earlier in this podcast, has, at time of recording, managed to spawn a record number of tornadoes within the state of Texas. And there's also been several other similar extreme weather events, such as the enormous wildfires that consumed Australia in 2019, or, for a particularly visceral memory for me, during 2020, there were enormous similar wildfires that swept across the American West and within the state of California were so severe that the sun was effectively blacked out by the soot and smoke kicked up by these wildfires for several days at a time. If you were looking for something apocalyptic, there was nothing that better fit than living in a city under lockdown in the height of a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, and then the sky turns black, the sun blood red, and it became necessary to put on heavy paint masks as well as turn on high-powered air filters to be able to breathe inside one's house or to go outside. The point is, if we're going to be serious about our animistic spirituality beyond an individual or small community level, then I think anyone who is engaging in heathen practice should absolutely be on the front lines of environmental struggle and fighting for environmental justice, both in terms of answering for and addressing the very serious problems that come about from large-scale industrial pollution and habitat destruction for the human beings who tend to predominantly be from marginalized communities, communities of color, and others who already get the short stick in modern society, but also environmental justice in terms of restoring and rebuilding that balance that relationship with the ecosystems around us that has been allowed to fall so completely out of whack under the auspices of allegedly rational and allegedly civilized forms of religion, spirituality, and societal organization that put humanity at the pinnacle of all existence and treat everything as being disposable and for human use and consumption, rather than thinking in terms of recognizing and working with the dignity, the needs, and maintaining good relationship with the world around us. Because really, when you get down to it, animism, from a political perspective, argues we are not the only beings that live in this world. We are in a world that is shared with a multitude of life and different forms of intelligence that must be respected and treated with dignity if we are going to keep this whole ecosystem that we are in, that we're all in, spinning along. And that's this explainer on animism. Thank you for listening, and this has been Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer, signing off. If you want to find out more about radical heathen practice, head on over to onblackwings.com, where you can find articles, classes, resources, and more. This podcast was created and produced by Ryan Smith. Thanks for listening.